We're going to run for an hour or so of panel presentations and debate, after which there's some refreshments of the usual form, which you'll find back outside. We have now lost 2 people, or at least 2 people have been delayed. We knew that Charles Hendry, who was to have chaired, was going to be arriving late because there's an important vote on the finance bill, which he had to attend. And so we've asked Jim Watson, who is the director of UKERC, to act as standing chair, which he will do, and he will introduce the panelists to you and look after you for the rest of the evening. And as you know, we're also at the moment missing Tim Yeo, but we're very much hoping that that won't be for very much longer. So I'll hand you over to Jim. Thanks very much to you all for coming, and I'm sure it'll be a very enjoyable conversation.
Okay, well, thank you very much all for coming. So as you can see, and as Rob announced, I'm not Charles Hendry. I'm certainly not as good at jokes as Charles, but I will do my best to chair the session. As Rob also said, we're expecting Tim Yeo any moment, so he will join into the panel when he comes. So just a few words of introduction from me. So I'm director of the UK Energy Research Centre. We're really pleased to be holding this debate with Imperial College and the BIEE, of which I'm also a council member. I guess the context for the debate is fairly obvious. You know, the title is about looking to 2020. What should the energy policy priorities be in the next Parliament? We've assembled a panel, hopefully with a range of views, to get a good debate. We're going to ask each panel member to talk for about 5 minutes to give some introductory remarks, and then we are going to move on to throw it open to question and answer, mainly from the floor. We will still go for an hour, and then, as Rob says, we will have some drinks. I mean, I guess the context is important here. There has been a lot of increasingly loud political debate about energy over the last particularly 1 or 2 years, particularly sparked by Labour's price freeze announcement, but around a number of topics, including whether wind farms are a good idea, what should we do with respect to shale gas, and many, many other issues besides. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is still a degree of cross-party consensus at work here in the UK, and certainly something that caught many people's eye was the cross-party agreement that was announced a few weeks ago, that was brokered partly by Matthew Spencer's body, Green Alliance, between the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives and Labour, committing themselves to the basic architecture of the Climate Change Act and the phasing out of coal as well. So there's a degree of consensus there. We also have to recognise that, you know, we do have very ambitious plans then attached to that flow from that cross-party consensus, and we've obviously started to make some progress down that road, but there's a long way to go yet. I think something I just wanted to, given Charles isn't here, something I wanted to quote that he often says when he speaks about energy, that many countries are bound by their energy histories, and in order to understand some of the debate in many countries, you should probably acknowledge where they've come from in an energy policy context. And certainly, you know, the UK's energy history, I think, is quite important in understanding where we are in the debate. One is that we tend to still run energy as a relatively centralised system nationally, and our policy debate tends to be centralised as well. We run it across the country. We don't necessarily have strong energy policy at the local and subnational level, although that's now started to change with devolution. We're a fossil fuel producer as well as a consumer, and I think that informs many of the dilemmas we face. And we're also an early liberaliser as well, and we still see the legacy of that and debates about that in the way that people talk about energy. So I think those things are worth bearing in mind. But without further ado, I will move to introduce the panel. So I'm going to ask them to speak in the following order. First, on my left, and that was not deliberate, but maybe it's apt, certainly on my left rather than yours. Baroness Bryony Worthington, UK Labour Party's shadow spokesman for energy in the House of Lords. Bryony has a very varied background in NGOs, campaigning, founded the campaigning group Sandbag, worked also in the industry for Scottish and Southern Energy, and partly in government as well, in the civil service. So quite a number of perspectives to bring to the debate. On my immediate left, who I'll ask to speak, I think, last before Tim Yeo, if he joins us, Jeremy Nicholson, Director of the Energy Intensive Users Group. Been involved in that organisation, I think, since 2000, it says in your biography, which is quite a long time to be following the debate. Hopefully know where some of the bodies are buried, and we'll have some interesting perspectives there. And a background in the industry, a member of Ofgem Sustainable Development Advisory Panel as well. And then on my right, Matthew Spencer, Director of Green Alliance. His tenure coincides almost exactly with this parliamentary term, so started in May 2010, so been there for 5 years, but doesn't have to stand for election to continue after May this year. And then a background in the Carbon Trust and a number of other organisations, particularly setting up the Wave Hub in the southwest of England. Tim Yeo, who will join us, is known to many of you as the chair of the Energy and Climate Change Committee in this Parliament, but has a long career in politics, including as member of the Thatcher and Major administrations. So we'll ask Tim to join us when he comes. If Charles arrives in time when we're still going, we will ask him to join the panel and join in with the Q&A. But without further ado, I'll pass on to Bryony to give your 5 minutes of introduction, and then I'll go through the panel in turn. So Bryony.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction, Jim, and thank you to all of you coming this evening. I think it's fair to say that Labour's been pretty clear about its energy policy, and certainly in 2013, we really started to, I think, influence energy policy whilst in opposition by announcing our price freeze policy and associated market reform proposals. And it's very important to stress that second part, which is often forgotten, because what we're going to be needing to do when we go into this new Parliament, irrespective of who's in power, but I very strongly hope it's us, is we've got to continue to manage the energy trilemma, and this has now become such a commonly used phrase, it's almost becoming meaningless. But what it means is you've got at least 3 competing priorities: that we have to have a secure energy system, we have to have a low-carbon energy system, and we have to have an affordable energy system. And as I said in the House of Lords, actually, during a debate, I don't think it's a trilemma, I think it's a quadlemma, but I was quickly corrected that I meant a tetralemma, of course. It being the House of Lords, they know these things. But I said, actually, I preferred calling it a quadlemma because that meant I could talk about quadrilla as exacerbating the quadlemma. And what I mean by the fourth pillar of this is that whatever we find that seems to match those 3 competing priorities has also got to be socially acceptable and socially and politically acceptable. So that element of it actually often gets ignored, but it can actually have a big impact on what you're able to do as government to make energy policy change or energy infrastructure change. A new Labour government would absolutely have a dual priority in energy policy of being strong and clear about our objectives in domestic policy, but working hard and having an influential voice internationally where there are also big policies that affect what happens in this country. And by that I mean working hard on the EU 2030 package, the policies that are being discussed in Brussels right now that are going to have an influence over decisions we make, and indeed the Paris negotiations, which will fall in December at the end of this year, which again hopefully set an international context for everything that we're trying to do. On the domestic side, as I've said, we were very clear, and Ed Miliband has been very clear about our priorities, which is to reset the energy market. And the reason this is necessary is because unless we have the trust of the consumers as we go forward on this decarbonisation agenda, we won't be able to implement the changes that we want to see. We have to have a fully open and competitive market so that we have no doubt that we are getting a fair deal in the prices that we pay. And at the moment, the vertical integration, which was a very useful facet during post-privatisation of being able to raise revenue to invest in infrastructure, we think needs to be changed. We're now moving into a very different world post the Tories' energy market reforms, where big infrastructure projects are largely now being decided on the basis of contracts that are underwritten by government, and that need for vertical integration is less. And it means that we can have a far more transparent and competitive market which splits generation from the supply of electricity to consumers. And we think that will bring in a huge amount of competition, new entrants to the market, and more transparency, importantly, about prices, so that we don't feel that we're being somehow misled or that the profits are being somehow generated in unfair ways. So that's one of the things. Associated with that would be the creation of a new regulator. We don't think Ofgem has been doing a sufficiently good job, and we want to create a new regulator with new powers and a different attitude and relationship with the industry. We also have said that we would introduce an energy strategy board. Now, energy security board, sorry. The reason for this is that it may all perceive this in different ways, but what is so frustrating when you're inside the policy discussions is the press running away continually with these stories about lights going out. It's just a perennial favourite, and often it's based on just pictures that come out of different, very, very learned academic institutions, or indeed, in some cases, the regulator, or indeed National Grid, but then they get spun into, oh my goodness, capacity margins are shrinking to nothing, we're all in a terrible situation, when the reality is we have an oversupply in the market at the moment. We've had it for a long time, and we just ran an auction for a capacity going into 2018-19 that was oversubscribed by a huge margin. And the prices in that capacity market were far lower than anyone was expecting because of that. And that's in the context of a period in which we're seeing energy efficiency, and by that I mean the whole range of actions that people take at industrial level down to the consumer to improve their efficiency of the use of their energy, to reduce their demand for energy, is having an impact. And we're seeing now flat or falling demand for electricity. So we need an energy security board in order to be able to have, as we do with the Committee on Climate Change, a body of experts that is designed to depoliticize this and provide expert advice from one central place that can provide the real picture on what's happening in terms of energy security. I'm not sure, I haven't noticed how much time I've got left. But
1 more minute.
1 more minute, oh my goodness. Right, well, so I've talked about energy efficiency. We've got a very clear policy. Caroline Flint last year said she was going to wage war on cold homes, about time too. It's an absolute outrage that we have such poor building stock compared to our neighbours on the continent, and that we continue to build poor housing, and we don't address the split incentives between landlords offering out very poor quality houses to people who simply can't then afford to heat the places that they live in. We know that the government in the last days of this parliament have just introduced new measures to make it illegal for landlords to not offer energy efficiency improvements. We would go further and set a clear long-term plan to get properties up to band C over a time period that they can know is going to happen, and provide the right kind of policies to enable people to do that. And that includes a new look at how the Green Deal's working, and the introduction of at least an introductory phase of zero interest loans to get people back using that scheme at higher numbers. I haven't touched at all on some of my favourite topics, which include carbon capture and storage. This is definitely on the agenda of a socialist government, as you'd expect. We are not anti-coal, we're anti-unabated coal. Sounds technical, but there is a big difference in that. Coal may well continue to be one of the cheapest sources of reliable power. If we can crack the emissions associated with that, then there's no reason why it can't play a role. And with carbon capture and storage technologies, there is a very real chance that can happen. Whether it will play a big role in power is to be seen, but it will certainly be needed in industrial sectors. We need to see a new industrial revolution in the UK. We are brilliant at engineering solutions, maybe not sometimes so good at holding on to them and commercializing, but we have the ideas, and we have academic institutions around the country working on very, very clever ways of sorting out the carbon capture and storage problem. We'll crack it. I have no doubt about that. The question is, will the UK play a leading role? And we will make sure that we do. Final word.
One final point. Yes.
One final word. Actually, no, I'm not going to talk about it because I don't believe we should be talking about shale gas.
Okay, fair enough. There's a challenge. Thank you very much, Bryony, for being succinct. So I'm going to pass straight on to Matthew Spencer.
Thank you very much. Looking to 2020 requires us, I think, to be clear about what success looks like. And for me, success in 2020 means that we have a maturing power sector decarbonisation transition, and we have a high degree of confidence about what that will mean in the 2020s. There are 3 criteria beneath that, I think, that are pretty obvious. Energy consumption has to be on its way down or continuing to decline. As Bryony said, we're doing okay in reducing energy demand, but we have a lot further to go. And we need to develop a market in the reduction in energy consumption, which we've notably failed to do. And we need low carbon power deployment rate to be up, with a healthy pipeline for the 2020s and costs continuing to fall. There's one final criteria for success, which is less conventionally discussed in policy circles, and that's that the benefits of decarbonisation transition have to be more widely shared, the direct benefits as well as the indirect benefits that come from reducing carbon dioxide, so that people feel more invested in the other things that I've discussed about energy consumption and low carbon power deployment. I'm reasonably confident, particularly following the agreement that we brokered across the parties, that the next Parliament will not lead to a change in direction in emissions reduction. But I think there's a very big question about whether will the means to achieve those ends. So let's just dissect that. Energy consumption down. The challenge is that, particularly for Tim Yo's party, is that it will require regulation, and often at a European level, particularly on product and appliance standards, which have been the most successful way of reducing energy and carbon emissions that we've ever seen in this country. It's saved each one of us around about £200 a year in saved energy from more efficient products. And we've got an opportunity to kickstart the next phase of innovation through the circular economy package, which is going to come through this new commission in the next few months. A second part of that energy consumption down challenge politically is trying to persuade politics to try again after the failure of Green Deal. I've lost count of the number of conversations I've had with senior politicians who throw up their hands when it comes to the discussion about home energy retrofit and basically say, we've tried everything, nothing works. And I think it's and we know that there are plenty of things that could work if there's a consistency of approach and a serious attempt to make it easier for consumers. But I think it's going to take more than logic and analysis to break the sense of that there's nothing at the end of the lever they pull on energy efficiency. And the best idea I've heard of recently is that there is a very rapid commission led by somebody pretty authoritative, as we've done so often in the past in British politics on pensions and other things, and spend 3 to 6 months identifying what it is that the next government has to do and giving them confidence and space to do it. Because I don't think we're short of ideas, we are short of political confidence that it can happen. Successful deployment will require an increase in consumer spend over not just this Parliament, but the following Parliament. And that's going to be a particular challenge for Bryony's party, because increasing consumer spend at a time when the narrative is about reducing bills is not going to be straightforward. I mean, it physically can be done if you can persuade the Chancellor and the Treasury of the day to do it, to increase the levy control framework from maybe 8 billion to maybe 10 billion. But given the battle that a Labour government would have with the media about conflicting messages, I think that's a serious challenge. But there is a solution, and the solution is to have a mission-focused infrastructure and innovation strategy, which is very clear that we are on a path to modernising the UK's infrastructure, particularly its energy infrastructure, and that it's low carbon at its heart, and that the innovation benefits to British business and the British economy are very, very clear and growing all the time. But it will take some courage to carry off the next stage of the growth of deployment of low carbon. And so the final point on sharing the benefits. Consumers are paying for decarbonisation and not getting much direct benefit. If you give to Comic Relief, at least you get a T-shirt or a silly nose. But with some notable exceptions, most of us as citizens do not get a benefit from decarbonisation. The notable exception is the success of the solar feed-in tariff, where 500,000 households are now generating their own energy. But the challenge politically is accepting that it's not always the cheapest way of decarbonising in the short term to share those benefits. But it is often the quickest way of getting to deeper levels of engagement and therefore support for deeper levels of decarbonisation. And the example of onshore wind is the most obvious, where we know that it's one of the cheapest ways of generating renewable electricity, but we have lost a small but significant proportion of public support, and we don't have a particularly active and engaged public support for that form of energy. I suspect that if we'd had shared ownership of the sort that we see in Denmark, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now in the UK, where it's increasingly difficult to deploy onshore wind. And I don't think you can entirely blame the dynamics of the Conservative Party.
Yes,
I've worked in the southwest of England trying to develop onshore wind, and I know that it is a generic problem which is not going to go away without greater shared ownership of the forms of generation. Those are my three challenges and the three solutions I think we can expect to work in the next Parliament.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Lots of food for thought there as well. So, Jeremy, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try not to interpret the fact that the consumer voice has been called last in a negative way, that this is just an afterthought, as has sometimes been the case where the climate change debate is concerned. Firstly, for those of you who are not familiar with the Energy Intensive Users Group, we represent large industrial energy users, gas and especially electricity users, some of whom are CO2 emitters in their own right, and all of whom have an indirect interest in the cost and security of decarbonising electricity supplies generally. And most of those industries, like steel and cement, to a lesser extent, certainly chemicals and glass and so on, they operate in international markets, and they're at risk of carbon leakage if we drive production costs up here by too much, and in a world where, unfortunately, we're not all yet signed up to the same agenda in terms of imposing costs on industry, or indeed the domestic consumer. And whilst priced impacts for the domestic consumer are an important factor, not least at election times, spare a thought for industry. Most electricity is actually sold to business and public sector and in industrial consumers on volumetric terms rather than to domestic consumers. And if we're to decarbonise our electricity supplies almost totally by 2030, if we're going to achieve our long-term objectives, that is going to have a profound effect on the industrial sector. And if we're to do that in a way that other nations are likely to copy, driving industry away from our shores is not a particularly intelligent approach. And just to put some numbers in your mind, and numbers are important. We haven't heard too many of them so far. I don't criticising the previous speakers, but sometimes it's necessary to hear some numbers to get a perspective on this. According to the Committee on Climate Change, the raft of climate policies we have at the moment, some of which are more efficient than others in economic terms, have already added 26% to the price of electricity to large industrial consumers. That's set to rise to 59% under the central fossil fuel price scenario by the end of this decade, in 5 years' time. And according to the Committee on Climate Change, absent compensating measures, a 98% increase, 98% by 2030, if any of our members are still around to face input costs of that magnitude. Now, if the rest of the world were facing such cost increases, there would be no competitive impact. It might have an impact on economic growth globally, and it might well be the right thing environmentally to internalise those costs. But rather like trying to lower the water on one side of the bath and not the other, there's a real difficulty in developed nations pushing so far ahead without support measures in place if we're actually going to pursue decarbonisation in a way that's going to work globally, as opposed to patting ourselves on the back for hitting arbitrary targets whilst emissions continue to grow elsewhere. Now, I've quoted the Committee on Climate Change figures. It's true that measures can be taken, and to a certain extent already are, to mitigate the impact on vulnerable energy-intensive industries. But of course that means if the targets remain the same, the costs for other consumers in industry, and domestic consumers, and or taxpayers will have to be higher than they otherwise would be. And I think that raises real questions about the economic sustainability of some of those targets. Now, the best answer for cynics like me who think this is all likely to prove unaffordable, in my view, is to have as much competition and R&D in low-carbon technologies as possible. There is no antipathy, by the way, from the industrial sector to cleaner energy supplies. It would be slightly strange if there were. And industrial energy consumers are literally neutral on where their electricity comes from. If it happens to be low carbon, so much the better. Historically, much of the baseload electricity for the industrial sector has indeed been low carbon, not because it was chosen for its environmental benefit, but just because that's what the nuclear industry provided. And it's important that we replace that baseload capacity with something secure. It's important we pursue renewable growth too, but not to the extent that it jeopardizes security of supply, or more likely, that it drives up the costs of backup for a very large deployment of onshore and offshore wind. the latter of which, unfortunately, is still proving to be quite expensive at many times the current wholesale price of electricity. And I agree with energy economists like Dieter Helm, who argue that we've spent too much on deployments of some of these expensive technologies and not enough on R&D. I remember a few years ago being quizzed by a consultant from McKinsey, doubtless with a salary many times my own, who seemed horrified at the thought that public money could be spent on R&D. He didn't seem horrified at the thought that billions of pounds could be spent on subsidising low-carbon technologies. He seemed quite relaxed about that, possibly had been commissioned to write a report in favour of it. I don't know. But he seemed to think if there's public support for the bringing on of early stage R&D in low carbon technologies, I would hope this would include, by the way, carbon capture and storage in industry as well as in the power sector, a subject which I know the Green Alliance and others have been touching on. He seemed mystified by this. He said, isn't there a danger that some of that money would be wasted? And I said, well, there's not a danger, there's a certainty. It's like firing a shotgun. There's a certainty that most of the pellets won't actually hit what you're aiming at. But that's not the point. It's going to be necessary, I'm afraid, if we are going to have a radical transformation of the global economy. It's going to be necessary to spend money on things which in the long run will prove not to have been worthwhile in order to identify the ones that are. And expecting the private sector to take all of that risk, I do not believe to be realistic. A quick point on the global context. At the time of the discussions running up to Kyoto, the United States was responsible for around 24% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions, and it was widely held to be the key. If we can't get something to work in America, why would the rest of the world follow? If you look at the emissions for 2014, China up to 28%. Whether they're growing or growing more slowly in recent years, I'm not quite sure. I hope it's the latter. We have got to find a solution that can be translated elsewhere. It is a fact that the UK is responsible for less now than 2% of global anthropogenic CO2 emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions to be more accurate. That doesn't mean we have no role in this, but actually means that our ability to demonstrate new technologies, to prove that something is deployable without putting industry out of business, that is far more important than actually the progress we make towards our own CO2 target, important though that would be. And in terms of making that affordable and shutting people like me up in the most constructive way possible, let's have as much competition as possible between and within low-carbon technologies. Let's move as fast as we can to technologically neutral support through CFDs for the mature renewable technologies, recognising that some will take longer to put into that bracket because it's competition that's going to drive these costs down, and it would indeed be totally in line with our international commitments. My last comment will be one read from the International Framework Convention on Climate Change, to which I think every country is a signatory, including those that chose not to ratify Kyoto. We are in fact obliged to pursue policies and measures to deal with climate change that are cost effective so as to ensure global benefits at the lowest possible cost. Well, hear to that. Unfortunately, there's considerable scope, looking at our current array of policies, for saying we're not actually doing it in practice. I wish we were.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Again, lots of food for thought. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask questions of my own, so I'm going to throw it straight open to the audience. Jim, you've strategically placed yourself, so you get the first one. Please wait for the microphone before you speak, and please introduce yourselves, just to say who you are and where you're from,
It's
anyway.
Jim Ski, and I rejoice in the title Research Council's Energy Strategy Fellow based at Imperial, also a member of the Committee on Climate Change. I've got a question about coal, but I can't resist responding to some of Jeremy's things, because of course, as a Research Council's person, I'm enthusiastic about more money for R&D, but I think it needs to be judged on its own merits and spent wisely as well. I'd be a bit reluctant to link it to reductions in deployment expenditure, when we've got the auctions, doing price discovery and getting the level of deployment down. So that's a comment. But on the coal side, I note that all the parties are keen to back out of coal. I was in Scotland yesterday, where the reverberations from Iberdrola's announcement that it's going to shut Lungannet early is rattling really strongly at the moment. There are issues associated with that. Coal plant did quite well in the capacity auctions, and a lot of the modelling that's done suggests that coal plant operated at a low load factor would have a cost-effective role to play in the electricity system by the end of the 2020s. So my question is it about getting out of coal, or is it about shutting coal stations down? And whether part of the answer is that to hit global targets, we do need to throttle back on coal use globally, and whether this is more of a kind of a diplomatic gesture from the UK that's leading us into the Paris meeting, rather than a sort of a cost-effective path towards our 2050 targets.
Thank you, Jim. I'll collect 2 or 3. I've got a second question just here on the front row, if you can get a microphone there, and a third one here, and then the next round I'll go further back in the room. So, please.
James Cork from the Renewable Energy Association, but used to be at Consumer Futures. So me and Jeremy have talked about this before, and I just want to back up the point that with exemptions from EMR, exemptions from the carbon floor price, and now asking for exemptions of existing policies, industry does have to pay something to do this as well, because every time you get an exemption, somebody in fuel poverty has to pay for it. So moving on from that point, and actually moving to the Dieter Helm point with R&D, is that these things can't reach commercialization in a lab. And if you're looking at what's happened recently with solar and with onshore wind and now with energy storage, these things are going to be cost parity by the end of the decade. That wouldn't have happened just in a lab. And I suppose the question, and if a Tory was here and with Bryony here, is that why do energy bills that happen every 10 years so good at legislating for the last 10 years and not for the next 10 years? And that surely we should have seen a move towards more decentralized energy and a move towards having that relationship that I think is going to happen in the next 10 years of bringing that away from a centralized energy system where consumers are going to have a lot more trust in what's on their rooftops, what's in their communities, and what they can actually control.
Thank you. And third one just here.
Thank you. Julian O'Halloran. This is mainly directed towards Bryony Worthington. You said, on the point of saying something, you said, I'm not going to talk about shale gas. Is that possibly because you and your colleagues, rather late in the day, began to stumble on some uncomfortable information about the environmental impacts of shale gas, not least the massive fugitive emissions, the methane being 85 times worse for the climate than CO2 that have taken place in the States. And also, of course, because the shale gas boom in the States ended up causing a flood of cheap coal across the Atlantic, which contributed to the UK burning extra quantities, big extra quantities, 25% extra or more in a couple of the last years. And really, that the Environment Agency's claims that it can stop all this by strong regulation have not really been backed up by detail.
Thank you. So I'll follow on that one first, Bryony, on shale, but if you want to respond to any of the other points, please do.
No, I wasn't hiding anything at all. I was just thinking that it would be quite nice to not talk about it because it's such a massive distraction. And the only reason we talk about it, really, is because the Tories decided it was their great big silver bullet answer to the energy trilemma. And it turns out they were basing it on a lot of hype, on thinking that we were just like the US and that we could just roll out what they've done over here. And obviously, there's almost everything about the UK energy market is different to the US energy market, particularly in that production space. We were very clear from the outset that we thought it could play a role and that we wouldn't rule it out, but that we wanted it to be subject to strict environmental regulations. And we already have, actually, in the Environment Agency, a very good and world-class regulator, which many states in the US don't have. But we perceived that there were some gaps in that regulatory regime that needed to be addressed, and we put forward amendments, and I'm glad to say those amendments were accepted. So. And now, I think if you notice, the Chancellor's speech at the budget, was there a mention of shale gas? Not a single mention. Why is that? Because the oil price is at $50 a barrel, and nobody thinks that now shale gas is a good plan at the moment. So it may come back. At the moment, it's a massive distraction.
Right. Jeremy, do you want to pick up this point about sort of deployment versus R&D, which you made 12 and was a subject of two comments?
I think actually there is an element of a trade-off here because we can't afford to do everything. That said, let's come back to the numbers. Currently, we're subsidising renewables to the tune of around $4 billion per annum through the renewables obligation and small-scale feed-in tariff, and the contracts for difference starting to come in. That will rise under the levy control framework to around £7.5 billion per annum by the end of this decade. And then when the nuclear costs, assuming they do, arise in the following decades, we're going to see even more added onto that. I would argue that a relatively small change in the amount of money spent in deployment can make a relatively huge change in the amount of money available to R&D. That's my only point on that. There's considerable scope for altering that balance without having a material impact on the overall, certainly on the overall emissions that we reach. I fully take the point that buying off industry by raising up everyone else's costs is not a sustainable solution to the problem. Ultimately, we're going to have to find another one. You know, I would love it to be a global deal on climate change, but I think, you know, realistically, that's not what's expected to emerge from Paris later in the year. And whether it's a combination of factors, Dieter Helm argues for border tax adjustments and so on, which I think will be problematic for other reasons. But I agree with you that simply loading the costs onto the others isn't sustainable. One quick word on the German situation. My God, the German consumer has had to pay through the nose for solar deployment. And there are many places where solar deployment makes an enormous amount of sense, particularly where solar is kicking in at a time of peak demand and it's helping to reduce system costs. So in California and Southern Europe, great. Why would you choose to deploy it in Germany? Simply because of a policy decision to do so. It's very generous of the German taxpayer, and more particularly the consumer, around half of whose bills now account for environmental measures in the domestic sector. It's very generous of them to subsidise R&D for all the rest of us, but I don't think we can afford to do that on offshore wind and everything else for the benefit of the rest of the world in this country. We're going to need more join-up support on R&D, the same way we have for fusion, if it ever gets anywhere, possibly for thorium use in nuclear, and indeed a whole load of other technologies. Some of this stuff is much bigger than the UK, but I think we can punch above our weight within that international effort.
Thank you. I was going to bring Matthew in either on that point, but particularly on the coal question that Jim asked.
So Jeremy's given a very jaundiced view of Germany. I mean, Germany has helped us commercialise solar around the world by being willing to pay for the upfront costs of the early stages of solar deployment, which in turn stimulated massive Chinese investment in manufacturing and which has reduced the price of solar around the world at extraordinary speed. So without one of the wealthiest nations in the world, Germany, having made that first mover investment, we would not have seen the shifts that are literally leading to solar undercutting many other forms of energy generation, particularly in the developing world. And the reason that the impact on consumers is so high is because German industry don't pay any of the costs. They get £7 billion worth of compensation every year. And so consumers are paying a lot more, which is presumably what you'd like to see in the UK, and I think it's a really bad example to give. So, on to the coal question. I mean, I think the issue with coal is pretty black and white. I mean, clearly we as an economy and nation have benefited hugely from coal over the last 150 years, but we now have to keep 80% of it in the ground in the world. The UK has led the process of getting out of coal. I think it would be hugely powerful if we can show how to complete that exercise in relatively short order and maintain a prosperous economy, which we will be able to do very easily. I don't see why coal peaking plant would be cheaper than gas peaking plant unless you're talking about a plant that's already been built and you're sweating the asset. There are other implications of doing that, not least of which are the other pollutants that emerge from the plant, SOx, NOx and particulates. So I would be pretty categorical about it. I would aim for a date in the early 2020s to phase out unabated coal in the UK. It would be of huge significance internationally, and we would hardly notice.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to go back to the audience now. So I've got one at the back, which I know was not right at the back. There's a gentleman a few rows forward.
Can you get a woman as well?
Yes, I'm about to do that, actually.
Shocking,
we can swap
controversial
places
idea.
if you want. So that one, and then I'll take the woman at the back and then the person just over here, please.
Hi there, Sasha Meckler from Meckler Consulting. The question is somewhat for Jeremy. So I work in the energy sector. I know how hard it is to actually change industries and get them to be innovative and change the way they do things. But the big question I have for the energy-intensive user groups is why is the question very much focused only on innovation in the energy sector to provide you with a lower energy cost? What about the manufacturing sector looking at reducing their energy intensity? And that might not be for exactly the same products, but possibly other products that service the same needs, because this is a horizon that pretty much most forward-thinking people who I think can speak authoritatively on this see as the next competitive horizon. It's the energy intensity of the goods that you can produce, because that creates benefits across the economy in ways that are very well aligned with renewable energy and efficiency generally. So, you know, just a little point. Why can't we look at it from both sides?
Thank you very much. There's the question right at the back there, one that's indicating. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Olga. I'm from the Climate Outreach and Information Network. So I'm going to ask a very untechnical question, which is basically where is the story in all of this, and who's telling it? So we heard Bryony and Matthew both talking about socially and politically, making it socially and politically acceptable to transition to a low carbon economy, public trust in the energy sector, the benefits of decarbonisation, and the public feeling invested in this transition. And I'm just wondering, you know, who's doing the stories and narratives that will lead to public buy-in, which will lead to political courage to forward this low carbon transition. COIN has just done a report for DEC, which came up with 4 potential narratives that might do this, and they chime very much with what you were saying. Avoiding waste is common sense, safe and secure future, taking control through smarter choices.
Sorry, can we curtail this a bit and keep it a bit shorter, please?
And affordable energy.
To come in.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks. The point is well made. Thank you very much. And there's a question just over here.
Marshall Hall from Oil and Gas UK. Do you agree that the 2020 targets were in some respects counterproductive? Do you think the adoption of a single target for greenhouse gas emissions for 2030 in the EU package is an improvement? And lastly, the corollary, the new Secretary of State after the election is going to have a decision to make next year as to whether to adopt a 2030 power sector decarbonisation target. Should he exercise that discretion, and if so, at what level do you think he should set that target?
Thank you very much. Before I ask the panel to respond, I'd just like to welcome Charles Hendry. Thank you, Charles, for joining us, the MP for Wealden, who's obviously a former energy minister as well as Conservative spokesman in opposition. Very glad you could join us. But also to let you know that Tim Yeo isn't going to be able to make it. I don't think the timings have worked in the end, partly because of the votes going on in the Commons. So, Charles, I will bring you in at the end of this round of questions, but hopefully you'll be able to hear the full round of the next one. We are going to go on for another 15 minutes or so. So okay. Thank you very much for joining us. So, over to you, panel, on these questions. There's one about industry innovation, something about the social and political transition and the social story, if you like, and then the EU target.
Can I start on industry? I couldn't agree more. Energy-intensive industries, by the way, have the strongest commercial incentive out there to be economical in their energy use. They don't like setting fire to their shareholders' money for the sake of it. Unfortunately, there are certain processes in life, like aluminium smelting, not that we have that left in England or Wales anymore, sadly, which are inherently energy-intensive. Indeed, there are certain processes where even if it could conduct them, whether in a laboratory or factory with 100% efficiency, would require considerable quantities of energy. And it's difficult to imagine a world without steel, aluminium, and some of those energy-intensive products in it, many of which are recyclable and durable and so on, and so have environmental benefits in their use, even though there are environmental inputs in their production. We, the Energy Intensive Use Group and the TUC, published a report just over a year ago on decarbonisation options for a range of energy-intensive industries. Good to see some of those getting picked up, including industrial carbon capture and storage. So that, combined with energy efficiency, I think should be very much on the agenda. We have our own EIUG manifesto for anyone who's interested for the next Parliament, and one of those points is supporting industry decarbonise and improve on energy efficiency. One quick comment on the 2020 targets, if I may. I think by far the best lesson we can learn from the 2020 targets is never to make that mistake again. Concentrating on CO2 is exactly the right thing for 2030. I might or might not like the target that comes out of it. I might think it's unaffordable. Other people might think it doesn't go far enough. But concentrating on allowing the market and individual member states to decarbonise at least cost and with least political resistance in terms of deployment of individual technologies has to be the way forward. And if anyone doubts that, think of the cost to this country of the 2020 renewable target, which we are not going to hit because it would require 15% of our energy, not electricity, to come from renewables. Enormous growth in renewables and electricity, commendable in certain respects, but it's not going to get us near the target. And how much is that costing us? The net cost, according to the relevant government department at the time, we were unexpectedly signed up by the former Prime Minister Tony Blair shortly before he left the post. Arguably one of his more expensive mistakes, more expensive even than the Iraq War and a number of other things that happened under his watch, came at a cost of over £100 billion. And the chief scientific advisor at the time also recommended we should never have signed ourselves up to it. So let's learn from those mistakes, for heaven's sake, and not bind the hand of the market or the governments that are going to have to deliver those 2030 targets.
Thank you, Jeremy. Bryony, do you want to respond to that? I mean, the Labour has been campaigning particularly on the power concentration target for 2030 and other things.
Yeah, no, yeah, the 2030 target, the times have moved on. We've now got a renewables sector which can produce electricity close to parity. So, you know, the 2020 target's delivered a huge benefit. And Jeremy, you know, you say, you know, this is all cost. One person's cost is another person's investment. And at this particular juncture where we're still coming out of a terrible financial crisis where confidence in industry is at an all-time low, the fact that we've got one bit of our economy happily pouring concrete and buying steel is a really good thing. And if it hadn't been for those targets, we wouldn't be. We'd be sitting there sweating assets that were built in the 1960s.
Cheaper energy. With cheaper energy.
No, again, the wholesale price comes down when you start having large amounts of energy that's coming from
because the add-on costs are all going up.
Let Bryony finish, because I could have interrupted you many times, and I didn't, because what I perceive is going on here is that it's very easy to be wise with hindsight, and of course we can all say, we should have just done it GHG, but then we wouldn't have had all of this investment into the energy system, and we'd still be literally sitting on a whole bunch of coal plant that now are coming off, being forced off by cleaner investment. And honestly, we talk about wholesale prices rising. What did we just think that those things we built in the 60s would last forever, and that they've been amortized many times over? We have to invest now in more capital infrastructure. That means wholesale prices have to go up. Your numbers don't have a counterfactual. We would have had to build new stuff anyway. We've happened to build stuff that's future-proof, and that's why it's a good thing for Europe to do this. People have said it already. We have a leadership role in showing, as a rich part of the world, that we can do this. And yes, we're going to make some investments, and some of them are going to be wasted. But you know what? We will find innovations in that process that will build a new industrial revolution. And it really, what I find most depressing, I think, of some of the energy-intensive users groups' approach is that they've been reduced to begging for little compensation payments here and exemptions over here. Where is the old engineering spirit of our industrial sectors who should be out there campaigning for subsidies to allow them to do deep decarbonisation? And we would then, as politicians, introduce those subsidies, and then you would have your CCS and not just be talking about it, but be delivering it. And that's what we need to see.
There's no support mechanism for CCS.
Exactly. Why is there no support, Jeremy? Because you've never asked for one.
Yes, we have. Yes. It's here. It's on there. It's on there. Have a copy.
In the last 6 months, they've realised, the penny's dropped, that this carbon thing isn't going away. Well, Jeremy, welcome to our planet.
Thank you very much. I mean, given that Matthew's organisation has published a report on CCS in industry today, in fact, very topical. I mean, do you want to comment on that point and this cluster of issues, but also this point about the social transition?
I happen to have a copy here. So we've been long-term supporters of CCS, but have become aware that we really have got to the point of so many delays to the CCS programme in the UK that it's looking very unlikely that CCS can compete with the other low-carbon energy supply forms when it becomes more competitive in the 2020s. Because we've lost at least 5 years in the CCS demonstration programme. And that whereas we do have choices in the power sector, and I'm pretty confident that offshore wind and many other technologies will continue to reduce their costs and play a very, very big role, there is no other realistic option for decarbonising industry other than CCS, and it deserves proper support. There are all sorts of ways one could do it if you were starting from scratch, but given that we've already committed, or we're meant to have committed £1 billion to 2 CCS power demonstrators, why not create clusters around those that allow industry to export their CO2, make sure the pipelines are bigger than they need to be for White Rose, and ensure that Scunthorpe Steelworks and BP's chemical works are able to export their CO2 into the same pipeline. And we've run some numbers. I mean, we've interpreted other people's numbers and shown that you get a really big reduction in the cost of carbon abated, but, and there is a big catch, there's a very much larger upfront cost to make that cluster work. It happens, I mean, it's around about £20 billion for the White Rose cluster, we think, which is about the same size as, on an annual cost is about the same size, same cost as we're going to pay for Hinkley. So it's not out of the bounds of current energy infrastructure investment, but it is a big upfront investment. And at the moment, there is no support mechanism for industrial CCS. You can't do it through a conventional power sector contracting scheme. You need a new form of incentive. It's either got to be a strike price for abated carbon, or it has to be some sort of incentive for storage and transportation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Charles, can I bring you in at this point if you have any comments, given that the part of the demonstration programme was happening under your tenure as Minister, but also the question that was asked, which I think you heard, about the 2030 European target.
Well, first of all, sincere apologies for being late. I think when we set the date for this, we thought the night before Parliament would be finishing for the election. It would be quite a relaxed night. Most people will be trying to go back to their constituencies rather than the final stages of the finance bill and a requirement to be there. So my apologies, and Tim's as well. I didn't hear the question on CCS, but just to say that we're seeing in a significant number of countries pushing back, delays or actually abandoning. In France and Germany, they've stopped. In Norway, it's being pushed back. The main place where CCS, I think, is being taken forward now is China, where they're not looking to find somebody else's technology and to cheapen it and to sell it back to them. It's actually where they're going to lead much of the technological work. And I think that's incredibly exciting of what's going on. I think there's fantastic work going on in universities like this, in Edinburgh and elsewhere. But we are in the danger, I think, of being squeezed out of that race. Matthew is absolutely right that the only conceivable way that we can decarbonise in the way that we need to is finding a way of decarbonising hydrocarbons. It can't all be done through energy efficiency and through renewables and other low-carbon sources of generation. It is proving much more complicated than I think people felt at the time when we started down this route, but that's no reason for backing away from it. And I hope that the UK will stay at the forefront of this, because we have a better reason than most countries for being engaged. We have the assets in the North Sea where we can sequester the CCS. We have the skills base for people who've been working in that environment over many years, and that we have the need for it to happen here as well. One of the changes we made was to extend the competition from just being on coal to say it should be on gas as well, because of the long-term relevance of that to the UK. But this is not a voluntary add-on to energy policy. This should be a core part of energy policy going forward because of its global significance and importance. In terms of 2030 and those targets, targets can drive ambition. Targets are important for saying to us, we can do better than this. A case of that is where we said for offshore wind, the target which I set the industry was their costs should be down to £100 a megawatt hour for projects reaching final investment decision by 2020. Because of innovation, because of the drive from industry, we will be well beyond that. In terms of it'll be well below 100. It will probably be closer to €100 a megawatt hour by 2020. And that's for projects being installed there rather than final investment decision. But what we had there was a target and a roadmap. And the danger in politics is you set a target, but nobody actually thinks whose job is it to meet it, and how we're physically going to do it. And I would almost make it illegal ever for a government to set a target without having a roadmap for how it's going to be achieved. Because my concern about the EU target for 2030 is it's just that bit too woolly. Nobody knows what each country is expected to do, and collectively there will be a sort of a meeting in 2025, and we think, this is a bit challenging, what are we going to do? And then they will invoke that rather magnificent element which is normally in those directives, which is the nobody could have foreseen where we're going to be now, and they will say, therefore, we don't have to meet it. If we're serious about this, then we've got to be clear about who needs to do what. But I do think, in general, it is right that it is a decarbonisation target there rather than a sector-specific target. I think we do need to leave it to individual countries for the mix which they want to use in order to get to that end goal. But it needs to be, therefore, it needs to be a general product to which individual countries produce their own roadmaps for what they're going to do rather than something which is too woolly.
Thank you very much. I've got my eye on the clock, but I'm going to go out to the audience for one more round, I think, and then I'll ask each panellist to wrap up. So I'll go just to the back there. There's one question. We've got a cluster over here. I'm only going to be able to choose two of you, I'm afraid, but I'll go one from each row. John, you put your hand up again, so you guess it, and the one just in front there. So please.
Hi, Matthew Aylott from the Consumer Association, which we're thinking a lot about traditional models, but I'm thinking more about disruptive change and about new innovative technologies, thinking about DSR, interconnectors, how they can compete with generators in the capacity market. So I'm wondering on your thoughts on disruptive change.
Disruption in the capacity market. There's a question just here.
Hi, my name's Philip from Vivid Economics, and I wanted to pick up on the question about social narratives. Not so much what should they be, but rather who can be trusted to tell the story of our low-carbon transition, our energy transition, to the public, and also who will politicians trust to tell that story?
Thank you for bringing that point back in. Actually, that's good to get the reaction of the panel. And
John Gibbons, UK CCS Research Centre. Very quick observation. Every time I go to China, everybody says, how many of these plants are you building in the UK? They do care that we show our commitment to build some, even though they could run rings around us in terms of numbers and cost. Yeah. And then the question, the next government might also only have 5 years to work on this. Do the people, particularly the politicians, think that 5 years is long enough? And if not, what could you do to actually keep policy going a bit longer? Because it seems like you get one bite at the cherry, and then you either get it right or get it wrong, and then something changes. So how would you get over that problem?
Thank you, John. So is 5 years enough question? I'm going to come back to the panel in reverse order now, so if that's all right, Charles, I'll ask you to answer first.
I think on John's question first, that it should be part of the goal of all the parties that from the 8th of May we start to take energy out of politics and the politics out of energy. We have an incredible amount of investment which is required. We still need the best part of 100 billion to come through. And we will reduce the political risk if it is less contentious, and therefore that brings down the cost of capital, and will make it a more attractive country in which to invest. So actually it's the election period which proves to be disruptive in that process, but I think that is better than the options of not having elections. I think 5 years if you... sometimes. 5 years if you've just lost an election appears a very long time away. So I think 5 years, good time. I felt it was part of my brief to try and take energy out of politics. When I left the government, I had really nice messages from Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg, Alex Salmond, so 3 out of 4 wasn't bad. But I hope that we can get back to that position of sort of really focusing on the longer-term national interest, which you can do actually with a 5-year parliamentary process. I think on disruptive technology, it's incredibly exciting what's going on. We're into an enormous era of innovation and of invention. And I think that when we look at what's going on in universities like this and all of the other universities, what's going on in companies, what's going on in small businesses, that it's an incredibly exciting time. And that's why we ultimately need to leave these things where we can to markets, because governments will be much better at picking losers than picking winners. And for those of us who are old enough to remember the old VHS versus beta videotape, for most people in this room don't know what videotapes are, it's something where ultimately the market will choose which is going to be the best solution. And those disruptive technologies will be driven by that. Some will need government guidelines. Interconnection, I think, is a case in point. Such huge investments that they will need government support to make them happen. But many of the most significant changes are ones which will be started in institutions like this and driven forward and will make incredible changes over our lifetime.
Do you want to comment just quickly, because it was addressed to the politicians on the panel on this? Who do you trust to tell the story or give the vision of the low-carbon transition, if I interpret it correctly?
I think trust is an issue. Clearly, as politicians, we are not overly trusted. Sometimes the energy companies are not overly trusted. Quite often we're the bottom two in terms of the trust register. I will worry Matthew by pointing to him in this, people who are in this sector who have campaigned with tremendous principle and tremendous integrity over the years and who've made an incredibly valuable contribution and never been political. And of course the academic institutions, that the work which goes on in these institutions, needs to be robustly peer reviewed, needs to be checked by others, and it gives us the material for being able to hear the new ideas and to hear what's going on. In a strange way, that actually this is a luxury which Bryony has had in this Parliament and I had in the previous Parliament. You learn much more about energy when you're in the opposition, because you can actually spend much more time at conferences listening to people. When you're a minister, you're expected to arrive late and to leave early, having taken no more than one question. And that when you're in opposition, you have the ability to spend hours there listening to people who know much more than you will ever know as a politician. And that's one of the best parts of the brief, although being in government is actually somewhat better than being in opposition.
Jesus.
Matthew.
Blimey, that's some responsibility. I think in a world where more and more of us communicate and find our information online, the idea that there is any one sector or person or people who is trusted by a large number of people is a fallacy. It's a many-to-many communications world we live in, and the work of COIN, amongst others, has identified that every different tribe, sector, cohort needs different messages and different messengers. So there isn't a simple answer to the question who's trusted and who's the messenger. We're all messengers in our own little tiny universes, and we'll all find different ways of doing that. That's a bit of a cop-out, but I think the sort of world of 1950s government information videos telling us all how to cross the road is kind of long since gone, and we shouldn't expect government to be our parent on this agenda. It has a responsibility to provide some stability and some direction, but it generally follows rather than leads. And the leadership comes from all of us setting expectations through our own relationships and networks. And so I think the growth of civil society movement around climate change that we're seeing re-emerge is very, very helpful. And the Climate Coalition, if you don't know about it, is a great tool for bringing everyone from the Women's Institute through to Greenpeace together. And it's very interesting, I'm not directly involved, but the message that they put out is for the love of, and they very much individualise the way that they communicate about climate change, because it's different for everyone. In terms of disruption, yes, I mean, we haven't talked very much tonight about the demand side, and I think that's where we want to encourage a lot more eating of the incumbent market for supply. And we've promoted the idea of a market for negawatts for some time. We have a pilot running in government. It's very small. They call it electricity demand reduction, but the original concept comes from America, where it's been very effective at providing incentive for companies to aggregate electricity savings, change lighting, change motors in homes and in businesses, and reduce the amount of power that we need. We've had a lot of action in the UK on heat, but we haven't had enough on electricity, and we would really encourage the disruptive effect of opening up supply markets to demand aggregators in the electricity market.
Thank you, Matthew. Jeremy.
3 points in response. Firstly, I'm disappointed that Bryony missed the evidence I gave to the Environmental Audit Committee on support for industrial decarbonisation 2 years ago, and I'll happily send you the reference to that if you've gotten it. Some of us have been arguing for this for a very long time, but let's put the pettiness aside. There are certain things that are easier to do in the power sector first and easier to do in industry second, but actually there are opportunities to do some of these things together in clusters where it could work. Not in every instance, and let's explore them. And I think that's a key issue that whoever's in power in a few weeks' time needs to hit the ground running on if we're going to get anywhere by the end of the decade. And without that, I think the credibility of our carbon targets, the ones we've signed ourselves up to already, our carbon budgets, let alone those we might sign up to in future, are going to look increasingly strained. Secondly, I think disruptive technologies and increased use of interconnectors. Look, this isn't a solution to all of our capacity and security problems, but it's certainly part of it. As we know within our own national market, greater density of interconnection helps reduce risk. And if it is more cost effective to have certain technologies deployed in one part of Europe and not another, and to make use of excess capacity in one part of the continent when there may be a deficit in the other, to the extent that it can be done, then that's a good thing, and certainly better than having a lot of part-loaded fossil fuel plant sitting there for backup. And if the demand side can play a role in that, certainly from an industrial perspective, that's a very good thing. Though one word of caution, we could have as much as 30 gigawatts of coincidentally intermittent power generating capacity on our system by the end of this decade. It's going to take more than demand response to balance that out on anything like that kind of a scale. That's larger than the domestic load on the system, but that doesn't mean there isn't an important role to play, particularly at times of system stress, which could save the consumer money and indeed save emissions overall. And lastly, on the question of trust, this is normally the point at which you make cheap jokes at the expense of politicians, elected or unelected in this case. I won't do that, but I will say that the consumer has been better served by organisations like Ofgem and indeed the Committee on Climate Change in their publications. Their analysis has been less politically controversial, I would argue, and certainly from a consumer point of view, more reliable and more transparent than many of the things we've had coming out of DEC. And I don't mean that just as a criticism of a recent DEC minister. But there is always going to be political pressure to gloss over things that the public don't want to see, and indeed things that policymakers themselves may want to realise. I'm afraid in a grown-up world there are always trade-offs to be made. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue decarbonisation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it faster than many other nations. But we do need to be honest about the costs, where they fall, and if necessary, to have mitigating measures, including, by the way, for those in fuel poverty. So my recommendation is that whoever's in government, forget the nonsense about abolishing Ofgem. If you want to call it another name, then fine. We have some institutions there that actually seem to work. And the Committee on Climate Change, for all its imperfections, seems to be one of those where the political consensus holds strong. So let's make use of those in being honest with the public about some of the costs as well as the benefit, because I think that's the only way you're going to keep trust going and avoid the risk of a backlash, which would destroy this agenda here and elsewhere for a generation.
Thank you, Jeremy. So, Bryony, you get the last word.
Wow, thank you. Who do we trust to tell the story? Well, I mean, in a sense, physics is going to tell the story for us. And by that I mean the evidence of the impacts of climate change are happening far faster than we ever thought. And our awareness of them is growing with every news report that covers it. And that's happening without anyone directing it. It's happening because this is what's happening. We're finding that the CO2 we've already emitted is now reaching concentration levels that are higher than have been for millions of years, and that's having an impact. It's a global scale experiment that we're conducting, and it's having ramifications, and we've got now a globally connected media that will report on this with ever increasing frequency. So that meta picture of why we need to act will just keep getting more and more persuasive and visible. And whether it's large chunks of ice or whether it's droughts in California or whether it's wildfires or whatever, actually, the number of impacts will just be more visible and there'll be more of them. In terms of then what we do about it, that's when we get into the nitty-gritty of how are we going to solve this? How is humanity going to step up for this challenge? And there's never been a challenge like it, ever. It puts everything, from apartheid to anti-slavery to everything into the shade. It's so huge and so fundamental, and it'll be the challenge of the next century, I'd say. But how will we solve it? We'll solve it through collective human intelligence in a more interconnected way than we've ever had, with the help of supercomputers that we've never had. And we will, I believe, find that there are technological solutions, social solutions, political solutions that will come to, will be tested, and the ones that work will be implemented. And that is what gives me hope. The human brain is wired up to do problem solving very effectively, and we will, I think, see more and more minds applied to this problem. And I see that all the time. I see the number of people who are actively now thinking, how can we change? How can we innovate? What can we do to solve this? Is growing exponentially. And there are now some of the richest people on the planet who've made their money not from traditional energy-intensive industries, but from the digital economy, throwing their money into solutions. And that, to me, gives me hope that we will make great progress. And there will be disruptive innovations, and the nature of those disruptive innovations is that we don't quite know what they are. I don't think, interconnectors in that space, actually. Interconnectors tends to, they've been happening for years, and they tend to happen because it suits the incumbents to be able to reach broader markets. And actually, one of the things we have to watch in the European Union is if Germany doesn't address its lignite problem, we'll suddenly find a whole flood of cheap lignite arriving into the UK at precisely the time we're trying to decarbonise our economy. So there are going to be, though, that said, a great deal of disruptive innovations, and particularly, I think, on the demand side, but equally also in industrial processes. On the final point, how do we lock this in for longer than 5 years? Well, you have a civil service. We have a civil service. They are an asset which does level out the political cycles. I hope that the next Parliament will apply itself to really thinking through the structures it needs to crack this. There have been too many siloed approaches, and in fact, the whole of government is still very siloed on this issue. It certainly isn't solely an environmental issue. It's not even only an energy issue. It's an economy-wide, society-wide challenge, and we're going to have to create the civil service structures that help us do that. We have the Committee on Climate Change, and I'm very pleased Jeremy gave a sort of muted support for that, because that obviously was created by the last Labour government in the Climate Change Act of 2008, and that's one of the proudest things that I can look back on Labour's record to say, that we introduced a framework that was sensible. It didn't dictate any particular solution. It just gave a governance system to make sure that we don't move away from this long-term goal of decarbonisation. And once back in power, we'll make similar sensible interventions to make sure that this industrial revolution truly takes off, and that UK has a big role in it, because it will benefit us economically if we do so.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being succinct, for all of the panellists, actually, particularly to Charles for honouring the commitment to come part way through. I hope you'll agree that it's been an illuminating, sometimes a really interesting debate, an animated debate, and I'm glad we've had 4 panellists eventually. So thanks to you, the audience, for sticking with us as well. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.